We begin in ancient times, a time so long ago that the term broadband referred to ISDN lines, which would operate at a massive 64,000 bits per second, the speed of a leased line, but magically switched on and off using the ISDN intelligent network. This time was the late 1980s and the early 1990s, was a time when the idea of a hyperlink was still considered the mad delusion of a wild-eyed prophet named Theodore Nelson. Hence my skepticism about Tim DL's research project. In those days, there were two kinds of networks. There was the so-called internet, and there were respectable networks. The respectable networks were being defined by international institutions, such as the International Organization for Standardization and the International Telecommunication Union. These institutions were based in Geneva, and their work product was meant for grown-ups. Grown-ups of sufficient means that the cost of a few $1,000s to buy standards documents was considered not only eminently reasonable, but absolutely necessary to the functioning of our standards-making organizations. These grown-ups worked for telephone companies like AT&T and their PTT peers around the world, and for a few industrial concerns like IBM and Siemens. Asking the International Organization for Standardization, asking ISO to give away technical standards would be as silly as asking the restaurant to give away the entrecote and the Beaujolais. In this world of many fine lunches and dinners, there was no free lunch. In those days, I couldn't afford the entrecote, certainly not the Beaujolais. I was a hack in the traditional sense of the word, making my living as a writer. A hack with a strong interest in the network, in the internet, which was a network based on open standards, a network with no kings, a network built on the then radical notion that standards should be based on decision by rough consensus and ruled by working code. And while this loose-knit band of anarchists that were defining the internet based on open standards were free to ignore most of the nonsense coming out of the standards professionals and their open systems interconnection effort, there was one thing we couldn't ignore, and that was the telephone network on which we built our unreliable, best effort datagram service. This telephone network was defined by the ITU in the 1988 edition of a document called the Blue Book, a 19,000-page compendium that contained the standards for things like how modems worked, how to compress audio, and the operation of signaling system number 7. Anybody defining internet standards that interfaced effectively with the underlying telephone network needed the Blue Book. But I couldn't afford the Blue Book. It cost 2,500 Swiss francs, and since I was making a living as a columnist for the trade press, for Communications Week, and since I couldn't write about what the Blue Book contained, instead I wrote a lot of columns about why the Blue Book should be free. At the time, the Secretary General of the ITU was a big Finn named Pekka Tarjani, a job he got as a reward after a career in Finnish politics, followed by 12 years as the head of the Finnish PTT. Tarjani had hired a lawyer named Anthony Rukowski as a counselor, and that was probably a mistake, as Tony Rukowski was in reality a double agent, an internet sympathizer who even used email. In 1991, the ITU was not exactly a technically progressive organization. They had lots of rotary dial telephones, of course, because their founding treaty specified they got free phone calls from all the PTTs, a fact they were very proud of and never ceased to point out. But there was no email and only a single fax machine for the entire 17-story building, and this telefacsimile device was carefully secured in a Deputy Secretary General's office and required a special form with many signatures before a document was considered fax-worthy. Tony Rukowski read my columns flaming about the ITU, and he got me a meeting with Dr. Tarjani. I flew to Geneva and soon found myself in a rather spectacular Secretary General's suite on the top floor of the ITU tower. After a few pleasantries about Finland, reindeer, saunas, we got down to business. I stated my case. The Blue Book ought to be available for free on the internet. Dr. Tarjani smiled the smile of a patient father and told me that in his ideal world, the Blue Book and indeed the Entrecote and maybe even the Beaujolais would all be free. But this was of course impossible, as much as we both might share this dream of an ideal world. You see, it really wasn't about the money, Tarjani explained. There was a technical obstacle. The Blue Book was being produced on an ancient mainframe using an ancient program, a program so old they had lost the source code, and nobody was quite sure exactly how it worked. They were developing a new typesetting system, but that was several years away, and for now they were stuck with only one output device, and that was their printing press. Dr. Taryani was sure I could see while he'd love to give me the source to the Blue Book, it wouldn't do me any good. Even his own expert technical staff didn't quite know how this black box worked. I suggested that we could try an experiment, and this is my first rule for radicals, called everything you do an experiment. And the experiment I proposed was that perhaps the ITU could furnish a set of tapes for the Blue Book, and the internet would try its hand at reverse engineering the system. If we succeeded, we'd give the ITU back their Blue Book in some coherent, ultra-modern format like T-ROF. Since Dr. Taryani knew the internet had only a few users, none of them of serious people of means who could buy standards, he'd be able to shut up the critics by saying he had cooperated, but the internet had not been up to the task. And he said we could have a set of tapes. I went to Boulder, Colorado, and enlisted the help of Mike Schwartz, a professor of computer science and the creator of the original search engine NetFind. After a few false starts, we managed to mount the tapes and read the raw data into a series of octal dumps, hundreds of pages long, which we spread on the floor next to a printed copy of the Blue Book. By comparing the octal dump to the final form, we were able to confirm that the Secretary General was correct. This system was a total mess. But after a lot of head scratching and a few surprises, we managed to turn their system into TROF and then into NROF, ASCII, and PostScript, and posted the tarballs on an FTP server and sent a note to the IETF list. The next day, the National Science Foundation called, complaining that the Blue Book release was using up all the bandwidth on the international backbones. The cross-Atlantic line was still just an E1 running at 2 megabits per second and costing the NSF $60,000 per month, and we were using all the bits. I reassured the government program managers this was a temporary phenomenon, and soon we had saturated our market with files spreading out to 500 hosts in 27 countries. Then word started to trickle back to Geneva that maybe the internet was a bit bigger than previously thought. And soon after that, a telefacsimile arrived from an ITU official who explained he had been instructed by the Secretary General to convey to me a message, and that message was that our experiment was now over. The Secretary General was insisting that we remove the Blue Book from our server, and oh, while we were at it, please remove all copies of the